Hello, hello, hello. For those of you coming here for the first time, I am Fred Feliciano, the CEO of Critical Conversations HR. And today we're going to be having a coaching session with, and I'll let her introduce herself and tell us more about her and her company and her background. So, Karen, it's all yours.
Perfect. Well, Fred, thanks for having me. I'm Karen R. Lucas. I'm the owner and founder of Tapestry, which to date has 15 subsidiaries. My most exciting launches recently have been the Vault, which is a remote HRIS suite streamlined for entrepreneurs and small businesses, but keeping those mid-sized firms who are struggling in this economy at the center of what we do, as well as ksmochagurlzwasted for all of my DEI gurus, DEI meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion gurus, right? We always know that there's this desire to put something together that keeps people connected, especially across large organizations, and focused on diversity being beyond what you see and what you know, to some of those other ways that we're all struggling to meet DEI initiatives. And so K's Mocha Girls Wasted offers an opportunity for companies to bring their affinities groups together from socialcation networkation standpoint, so hosting events on location in varying countries and cities around the globe. I'm really excited to be here today. Going to business for myself has been very interesting. Being a sole proprietor, I think, has a lot of positives but a lot of challenges, and so that's what brought me here today.
Okay. So, just out of curiosity, what motivated you to be independent and to start your own thing? Because for a lot of people, you could imagine it could be very scary. So, what prompted you to go in that direction?
So it is very scary, right? I think one of the things that I am always struggling with is pivoting back into full time employment because let's be honest, there is a level of security with knowing that you show up to work, your check is going to be deposited in your bank account, right? You can't beat that.
Hmm.
I think for me, being in business for myself is not about not wanting to have a boss because even as a business owner, your boss is your client, right?
Hmm.
But for me, it was about wanting to have create that creative autonomy to achieve my job the way I want to achieve my job, to get it done on my terms. And I feel like when you're an employee, there's a different set of terms that you have to get something done by, right? Like you got to be married to getting to work at a specific time. And
Hmm.
while no one is holding you to what time you walk out the door, you are held to what time you walk in the door. And so I think for me, I'm someone that likes to take deliverables by the bullhorns and get a project done and get it done at my in terms of how I feel done is or at my standard, as opposed to having to water down a product to meet a commercial standard, right? Or working on teams that may not always be in alignment. We know that HR is one of those things that everyone, pretty much employees, can take it or leave it, and companies feel the same way, right? And some organizations it's done well and people really value human resources and it's a well thought out division, and others it's just considered a band-aid, right? So there are a number of challenges you face as an internal HR team that as a consultant on the external end that I don't necessarily need to face, right? Because
Hmm.
I get to kind of cut around all the red tape, identify what needs to get done, and then deliver that project without all of the, you know, conversations. Great reason why I'm here today around
Hmm.
human resources and disalignment that it typically has with other divisions.
Okay. So, I wanted to just reiterate on a point that you made. You said something to the effect of even when you're independent, you have someone you have to answer to. You have a client,
Right.
right? Or you have clients per se. And even if you're independent, you have some sort of regulatory body, someone that you have to answer to, taxes you have to pay, so on and so forth. So I think that's a very important thing that a lot of people don't know about being an entrepreneur is that, if you're not answering to an employer, you are answering to clients.
Right.
So, if and just a follow up question about just to help me better understand the businesses that you have. You mentioned I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a parent company, and then you use the words subsidiaries. Is that
Right.
correct? So
Correct.
could you maybe just go back and talk to me more about the parent company and their relationship with the subsidiaries?
Sure. So Case Tapestry is about kind of not reinventing or reimagining, right? Because those two phrases have stigmas on them that typically mean taking trying to make something that is bad look good, and that's not the intent. Case Tapestry
Mm,
is a company that looks a remote first company that looks at human capital from a different perspective, right? So when we look at things internally in terms of our KPIs about cost to fill, downtime once a role has become vacant, right? And from an HR perspective, we understand how much that impacts the bottom line. What Case Tapestry does is with that in mind, helps organizations strengthen internally so that they can reduce their retention, right? And
mhm,
so when I was thinking about what area of business I wanted to go into as I began to have the internal dialogue about where I want to be in my career, I realized that retention is one of those things that most people really don't address. It's almost
mm,
something that's accepted. It's like, oh, we have a high turnover here, but in our leadership team, we have a solid group of people that have been with us for 20 years, right? And so, what my organization does is it comes in and it kind of audits your organization, not from a fiscal perspective, but from a people perspective, right? Because we understand that people is our greatest resource. And so, that iteration is carried out across 15 different organizations that are part of Case Tapestry as a whole, right? And so basically, the other part of that is that human capital exists in every industry, right? No matter what you're in, music, sports,
mm,
fitness, there's always an employee and a boss, right?
mhm,
Restaurants, hospitality, and so Case Tapestry looks at the human capital retention aspect in every industry, and that's the result of the varying subsidiaries. So Case Tapestry is the parent company, and then all of the other subsidiaries are iterations of human capital from a different perspective, but always with the focus of building stronger organizations by helping them reinvest in their most important resource, which is people.
okay. And I wanted to ask you one more question before we get to why you're here. So you mentioned being a consultant coming into an organization where a company already has HR personnel. Do you think that your job is a little bit easier coming from the outside, coming in and making assessments, and maybe sometimes people internally don't have the voice that you do?
Yes and no, right? Because the difference is that as a consultant, I'm developing a new relationship with an organization, whereas most of their team members and leaders have been with the organization for quite some time. So what they
Mm,
have is what we like to say, they have money in the bank, right? And that relationship, as opposed to a new account that is only going to make deposits or deductions based on, and I like to borrow that term from a CEO that I've worked with really briefly on a project out of Kansas, right? And so that is the whole purpose behind bringing in a consultant. To some degree, yes, you have the
mhm,
ability to say some tough things that maybe other leaders or employees won't say because of, fear of job security and all those things. But you also are building in a way that the other employees don't have to build, right? So if someone who's been with your team for 15 years says, oh, I feel this or I feel that, it has a little bit more weight behind it than, let's say, me, a neutral party, saying, yeah, I kind of concur with that thought, or I'm going to take that a little bit deeper because this is what I hear. This is what I see happening, right? There's a disalignment between what you believe the job should be, the job as
mm,
it's advertised, and what it takes to get the job done, right? And so we might be seeing the same things, right? So I might be able to get what's called some cash back on that philosophy that I'm in alignment with. But mostly, I'm then able to utilize that to, of course, build my own relationship and establish why having a consultant on board helps.
mm. Okay, great. So, what brings you here today? How can I help?
So when I saw you were doing this, I was like, oh, wow, you're kind of like in the same boat that I'm in terms of
Mhm,
having something in addition to what you're doing in terms of career. And so I think for me, some of the frustration that I have is that, like, if you hire my firm as a consultant, rest assured that I'm going to do the best job that I can, that I'm always going to be honest, I'm always going to be integral. But where do you begin to shape the discussion where sometimes people feel like if I'm your first client or if I'm one of your first 10 clients, that there's some level of, there's a transfer of power, a transfer of ownership, or you're not a client, you're an investor, right? Like, how do you re-educate your clients so that they understand where they stand in relation to, hiring a Black owned firm, right? Or a woman owned firm, or in my case, a Black woman owned firm, right? And so I know that we have some affinity group alignment. I was wondering how
Mhm.
you have been able to lead that discussion as you continue to, grow within what you're doing within HR.
Okay. So I just want to be sure I got the question right. So the question is, how do you mentioned in terms of ownership, when you speak of ownership, are you referring to ownership of a problem, ownership of the situation internally, or
It's three-part, right?
okay.
So you just launch a firm, right? I just launch a
Mhm.
firm. I get my first client. How do I educate my clients so they understand, as excited as I am about you, investing in my company by signing a contract with me, that I need you to let me do what you hired me to do. One, right? So I need you to let me to take
Mhm.
ownership of what you hired me to do. I need you to understand that you are my go-to person, right? You're the CEO of your company. You want to run your company the right way, but you brought me on because you don't want to run your company into the ground. Correct.
Got it.
So
Yeah.
let me do what you hired me to do. But most importantly, that when there is a disconnect, that it's got to be from a stakeholder perspective, right? Like, you have to remain invested in why you brought the person on, let them do what
Mhm.
they did, and then take accountability for, how do you teach your client to take accountability for what they may have caused, right? Like, if there's a disconnect or if there's a disalignment, without it kind of getting deadlocked, because sometimes people feel like when they're your first client or your first client after a pause, that all of the, how do you say, all of the power, and that's not the best word, is in
Yeah.
their, in their space, and kind of like there's this level of, you should be so grateful. So how do you change? I think that's where I'm struggling. Like, how do you change that language and
Got it.
stabilize the relationship?
So I think the first piece you mentioned, I wrote down parameters of the gig, right? So for
Right.
me, every good relationship, whether it be personal, business, professional, there is clearly outlined expectations of what my role is and what your role is, right? So for
Right.
me, I think that would be probably one of the biggest things, and I'm pretty sure you already have in your contract an outline of what your role is, but maybe it is the way it's phrased, or maybe or maybe specific examples have to be included in there, and the ones
Yeah.
that the examples of conflict, I think,
Right.
come up a lot, right?
Right.
So, and then moving on to my second point, you had mentioned having a key point person. Like, for example, my mission is to transform workplaces one person at a time, right?
Right.
So I'll work with managers and work with them on a progressive discipline system and how to administer that in their organizations. So
Okay.
typically, one person has to be the ambassador. One person has to be the cheerleader for you, right?
Right.
So just imagine, like, I see myself and I see you as this, star player that's been, um, what's that term when there's a draft, like a draft pick star player,
Yeah.
right? But the internal person has to be able to put credibility to the work that you're doing. They have to co-sign it, right? And they also have to be the ambassador, and they have to take some level of accountability in that.
Right.
So I think in part that's, a conversation that's had early on, and that conversation continues. I think what sucks, and this happens in life all the time, and I'm sure, Karen, you're aware, or you've had clients who's been in the situation in which people say they want something, but when it comes time to actually doing it, that's a whole other situation. Like me, I would love to, to be 75 pounds lighter, right?
Right.
but but my actions currently don't reflect that per se. It's something that I'm working on. It's something
Right.
that I have to do, but it's something that there isn't a level of consistency there. So therefore, my body is going to be a reflection of my discipline and of my habits or lack thereof.
Right.
So the same thing is said with, working in an organization and working with someone internally. That person really needs to be the ambassador. They have to be the gatekeeper. They have to
Okay.
be the cheerleader for you to be able to be effective in your role.
Okay. That's some
Um,
really good feedback. So I think that that helps me change the dynamic of the conversation as I am discussing potential future contracts.
mhm. I think also I think about many years ago. I mean, I've been married roughly now for about 8 years, and my wife and I did premarital counseling through the church before we got married, right? And part of premarital counseling, there was a discussion about how are you and your wife going to deal with conflicts?
Right.
So I think that same thing has to be said with employers, with
Okay.
people that you're working with. If there's a conflict, how are you and I going to deal with this conflict? And that should be part of the engagement letter.
Okay, perfect. Those are really great tips. And it's like, it's hard when you're a new business, even though I have been in business for 9 years, every new contract is potential for strengthening my brand, for, establishing what I'm capable of doing. But I find that I keep running into these same walls, right? And I think it's because I haven't been looking at the issue from that angle, right? And yeah, I'm really good at setting parameters, but I need to do better at getting those in my contracts, but also identifying key people who are going to be the neutral party when there is a deadlock or, disalignment on a particular issue or matter.
Okay. Yeah. And a couple of days ago, I did a video about questions to ask your new manager, right?
Right?
And I think one of those questions was in terms of having regular check-ins. And I think as a contractor, and I'm sure this might already be been worked into your engagement letters or your contracts. How often are we going to check in, and how often are we going to get a sense of the pulse of the
Right.
work that I'm doing? So, let's say you have a 6-month engagement, maybe there's a monthly check-in you have with that employer,
Okay.
that organization, to get a sense of, how people are feeling, how the ambassador is feeling about the work that you're doing. I would also recommend this may or may not be a possibility depending on your employer, or it may be something that your ambassador does, but there should be some sort of maybe survey, doing a survey, getting a pulse of the employees, especially when you're doing different types of initiatives, to see how they're going, because you may not have contact with all of the stakeholders.
Okay.
So let's say if you're doing a block of work that's affecting 75 people, in some cases you might have access to 5% of those persons, or 10%, or even one person.
Okay.
So, your ambassador may be telling you something, right? Or your key point person, but how it's being, how those waves are in the ocean might be taken a very different way in terms of the
Right.
people in the organization.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I think my next thing that I wanted to address, I'm not sure where you are, if you are maintaining full time employment while pursuing your other aspirations. As you know, going to
Mhm.
business for yourself does not always translate into immediate financial success. So, how do you balance that conversation between maintaining full time employment while pursuing your, professional aspirations as a business owner? And
Mm.
how do you kind of broker that topic with your employer or future employer, as well as your clients, so they understand that there isn't a conflict of interest within
Okay,
HR?
so when you say your future employer, this means someone who is going to be offering you a full-time gig or part-time gig, or
Either or. I mean, so
Either
right,
or. Okay.
right, yeah.
Okay. So there's different questions there. There's
Okay,
different avenues of going about it. So, one is you have and this piece is not related to any employers or any contractors or
right,
people who would contract you out. There's a personal question that you have to ask. There's a question that you have to have with your significant other, if you have one, or your family, in terms of how long can I do this? What do I have to bring in financially? In some cases, there's a famous YouTube channel, Dave Ramsey, and he has a gentleman by the name of Ken Coleman who speaks about career pathing, right? And he also speaks about if you have your own business, typically some people won't start a business unless they have a certain amount of money in reserves to cover their, what they earned as a salary. If someone has an emergency savings, that's very helpful. So I think there's the financial aspect that people have to answer, or you would have to answer for yourself, right? And that's a very sort of deep going into finances and talking to your family members about that. That's a whole other separate kind of conversation, right? More of an
right,
internal conversation. So that's that, and I think that has to happen first before anything, before anyone starts their own business, assuming they're married and they have a family. Some people are single, and some people can take a lot of chances very early on. Some people can't do that, right? So I think that's the first piece: looking at your finances, seeing what your reserves are, sort of planning for the worst, right? And then in terms of dealing with potential employers, I think what you would have to be is the H word. And do you know what that is? What H stands for?
no, tell me.
Well, I want to say H and T, you know, excuse me. Honesty. You have to be honest,
Of
right?
course.
So if you're interviewing at a place and if you're interviewing for part-time work, I think you should be honest that, you have a side gig. And most likely, I would say, you know, seek out roles that are going to be part time or temporary. One where you having your own LLC is not going to be a conflict for the person that you work for.
Right. And I think I always lead with that. So when people ask
Hmm.
me what's my intention with my business, I never give anyone the impression that I'm going to fold Kate's Tapestry to pivot into a
Yeah.
contract or a full time job. So I'm always honest about that. And I am always appreciative of companies that are like, oh, well, then that, I certainly don't see a conflict. Should we extend an offer? That wouldn't be an issue. Versus, companies who are like, oh, I think that that might be a conflict, so we won't be able to move forward. I do appreciate the honesty on both ends. But you know how much I hate to guess. So when you were like, do you know what the H word is? I was like,
Yeah. No. It's okay.
human resources? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm always honest about that. And I think that, yeah, there's nothing you can gain from dishonesty, right? Other than loss. And you have a 50-50 chance of gaining what you want by honesty, right? So yeah, I
I
think
think
that
so.
that's something I'm always forthcoming about. It's on my resume. So when people schedule an interview with me, it's the first thing that you see. So I try to keep that kind of out front so that there is open communication and transparency as well.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, one thing that could help is just, seeking out the opportunities where, there's no hope of that being a conflict
Right,
per
right.
se. Like for example, like myself, if I were to look for something, I'd probably look for something, temporary, something for a couple of months, something part time where I can balance my business and balance doing another gig. The only thing that I would say, and you and I are both HR people. We both have done recruiting, right? Right.
Yeah,
And we know that you have theory, just like, for example, when we say people should not be discriminated against, right? In
right. That's it.
theory,
Yeah,
but we know it happens. We know it happens, and sometimes, like, we deal with managers who may say something, who may make a hiring decision that's not in line with our values. Do you agree?
all the time. It happens all
Yeah.
the time. Part of
It
HR is coaching, right? Coaching people on what is appropriate, what's inappropriate. You know, we have this theory that you're supposed to check your personal beliefs at the clock, right? And that
Okay.
doesn't mean you can't be yourself at work. It just means we all have our things. We're all human, but your
Mhm.
things, your beliefs, your personal systems are not supposed to impact others at work, right?
Bingo. Yes.
Period.
Yes. So I say all that to lead up to this point that I'm going to make. So I mentioned the theory and how things should be a certain way, kumbaya, reality is something else. So I say that to say that, and you and I are in the same reality, is that, an employer may think differently. The moment
Right.
they hear you're independent, you have your own company, they may not want to employ you. They may have their own set of beliefs. They may have their own biases about that, and it may not work out. So therefore, the best thing is just to put it on the table so that if there is an issue, it's an issue now, and you haven't invested a whole lot of time with that person or company.
Right.
So I always say put it out there and just let people know. And LinkedIn is not a secret, and like anyone can go on LinkedIn and see somebody's profile
Right.
and or take a
Right.
look at their resume and see their background and see what they're currently doing, and then there's a conversation about it. As long as you're prepared to answer questions about it, then
Yeah.
you are good to go.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay. Any other questions or
No,
any
I
other
think you
concerns?
No, I think you've been great about helping me figure out like that solution gap because I didn't have any go-tos on that. So I definitely think I'm going to be able to step away from this first session with some tools about moving forward. I think there's a lot of alignment. Again, we both started in recruiting, so there's a lot of like-mindedness. I think I have some conversation pointers to have, right? Like, so right now, I may or may not move forward in a full time gig, which makes sense for me based on the kind of space that my company is in on its own contracts, right? But you gave me some pointers in terms of how to navigate that should I move forward. So I think that's really helpful.
Okay. So a question for you is because I never believe that any session or interaction people should walk away with without any homework. Okay.
Right.
So maybe tell me 1 to 3 things. Even if you give me one, I'll be happy. What's one thing that you got from this session that you can put into practice by next week? By, let's say, a
Sure.
week from today.
So, number one thing is identifying who my neutral person is every time I go into a contract so that I know who I can soundboard off of, who is going to be in alignment with me and kind of, you know, stand in support of me or stand with me if an issue gets becomes in disalignment. I need to also just make sure that I'm doing a better job of ensuring that the work scope is included in the contracts that I sign so that
Mhm.
there is no like surface disalignment. So I think those are my two pieces of homework.
Great, great. So, so where can people find you if they want to seek out you
Sure.
and your services? Maybe do a little advertisement on that.
Perfect. So if you are interested in an streamlined HRIS onboarding suite, you can find me on the Vault. That's the THE VAUULT.ecwid.com. If you're looking to kick off the fall winter year at your office with a slamming DEI event, you can find me at KS MOCHA MOCHA GURLZ wasted.ecwid.com.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Karen. It's been a pleasure connecting with you, chatting with you, and let's connect again next week to hear how things are going.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Fred, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, take care.